evening, everybody, and a warm welcome to a new series of London lectures brought to you by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. As some of you will know, and in particular those of you who studied our new banner will know, this is no ordinary series of London lectures, nor is it an ordinary year for the Royal Institute, because the Royal Institute was founded exactly 100 years ago in 1925, although it only became royal in 1946. I can't swear that these are the 100th series of London lectures. In fact, in the founding year of the Royal Institute, you could attend no less than a course of lectures every weekday evening if you had a mind to. What stamina and dedication those ancient folks had. Now, I'm afraid it's only one a week, and from October to March at that. But still, it's a special series of lectures in another respect. Usually, as some of you again will know, they are lectures on a theme. Last year we had Remembering and Forgetting. The year before that we had Madness and Mental Health. This year the theme is Philosophy, Retrospect and Prospect. And I've given our speakers a slightly broader brief this time, inviting experts from various different corners of philosophy to say where they think their bit of philosophy has got to, perhaps over the last 100 years, and where they think it might go from here. You can watch all the other series on YouTube and on podcasts, listen to them as podcasts. These will be available on YouTube pretty swiftly, and as that point implies, all this evening's proceedings are being recorded. So if you don't want to appear on a recording, or you don't want your voice to be part of the recording, please let one of our technicians at the back of the room know, and they will make sure you're not in it. So happy birthday, Royal Institute of Philosophy. I hope you enjoyed the series. That's enough about us this evening. It's a great pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the series, Nikhil Krishnan. Nikhil was born in India. He then came to Oxford, to Balliol College as a Rhodes Scholar, where he read PPE and then stayed on to do a doctorate. He then became a lecturer and fellow of Robinson College, where he taught philosophy for some time, 5 years, I think, and he's still Director of Studies and Fellow of Robinson, and now also teaches philosophy at Winchester College. He has written a fascinating book called A Terribly Serious Adventure, which will be known to many of you. It's a history of Oxford philosophy, and it was, how can I put this? It really was very exciting between the years of 1900 and 1960, which were the years Nikhil is writing about, which is not to say it's not still very exciting, but that's another matter. And his essays appear regularly in Eon, New Statesman, and other glamorous venues. So, Nikhil, over to you. Do you want to? Oh, hang on. There's one thing I should say that I'm forgetting. The talk will run for about 40 or 45 minutes. As usual, we'll have Q&A afterwards. But there's a little innovation for those of you who've been to these things before. The reason we've got these two chairs up here is that the Q&A will kick off with Nikhil and me occupying these places, and I'll ask him a couple of 2 or 3 questions just to get things going, and then we'll hand over to you for the Q&A proper. So please give him a round of applause. Sorry, Jeffrey.
Let me start by asking you to confirm at the back that I am audible to you. Yes. Yep. Not too loud for the ones nearer. Excellent. Good evening. Let me start by thanking Professor Harcourt and the wonderful administrative staff of the Royal Institute for the invitation to speak here and for the enviably thorough organisation of this event. And apologies for not replying as fast to their emails as I should have done. It's a pleasure, and it comes with a certain moral risk, one might say, to address an audience whose attention has not been purchased by the promise of some academic credential coming your way at the end. Now, I should say the last time I'd spoken at one of these events was nearly 10 years ago, when it was in the large and charming Dr. Williams's library, and I wrote my script with that space in mind. Reading it today as I was coming here on the train, I realized that The style, in consequence, is going to seem just a tiny bit more portentous and pompous for the space in which I'm actually delivering them. So I'm going to try, no doubt with many hiccups along the way, to ad-lib away some of the more pompous things I was going to say. I think it would have worked in the old venue. I imagine it will work rather less well here. So my theme tonight is the persistence of romanticism within the analytic tradition of moral philosophy. I know that's not quite what my title immediately promises, but I promise it will all come together nicely by the end. Now, when I say romanticism, I'm talking about not a doctrine or theory, but a kind of temperament, a powerful and pervasive temperament among human beings. And I want to suggest in this talk that certain romantic habits of mind, a respect for imagination, a distrust of abstraction, an insistence on the integrity of individual experience, that these things continue to shape some of the more humane moments in the moral thought of the last 100 years. And I wanted to suggest further that this inheritance of romanticism may help us to resist one of the characteristic moral pathologies, perhaps of our day, perhaps of all days, and that is a pathology I will call moralism. Now, by moralism, I don't mean moral seriousness or earnestness, not even moral zeal, but a certain familiar tone of accusation in which moral language is used less to illuminate than to condemn. It's the tone in which moral reflection hardens into posture and moral life into a kind of performative theatre. We know it in politics and in the so-called culture wars, but also in subtler ways, in the ways that aspects of our life we thought of as matters for private judgment and discretion, what we eat, what we feel, whom we love, what we take pleasure in, these are taken to be matters of public moral judgment. Now, I'll be saying that philosophy has a peculiar relation to moralism. It can encourage it, even become a vehicle for it, but it can also offer a cure. Here's one way of putting it. From its very origins, philosophy has had two opposed tasks. One has been to problematize what had previously been thought self-evident, to expose hidden assumptions, to question the moral innocence of our habits, to show that what we took for nature was in fact history or culture or convention. But the other task has been to unproblematize what has been moralized too far, to recover for ordinary life and private judgment the domains that should never have been surrendered to the tribunal of morality. And I'm interested tonight in this second, quieter task, in the possibility that philosophy might remind us that not everything is a moral question, and that even moral questions are not always improved by being declaimed in the language of blame and condemnation. So that is the problem I hope to address. And the story begins in Cambridge in 1903 with the publication of G.E. Moore's Principia Ethica. Now, Moore wanted to know what sort of thing goodness was. With apologies to those for whom this story is exceedingly familiar, one of the nice things about the Royal Institute of Philosophy is the possibility of talking to people for whom things very familiar to academic philosophers might be unfamiliar. So I hope those of you who are familiar with these matters will forgive it if I explain a couple of things too many. So Moore wanted to know what sort of thing goodness was. Was it something that was part of nature, something that could in principle be observed, like redness or temperature, or was it something of a different order altogether? Now, Moore's answer, which was both simple and devastating, was that goodness was real, but non-natural. It couldn't be analyzed in natural terms. It could be grasped only by something he called intuition. One could recognize goodness, but it couldn't be defined. And that distinction between the natural world of empirical facts and the non-natural world in which value goodness resided, that became the starting point of a century of moral philosophy. For once one grants that division, it takes a lot of effort to bridge it again. the discipline of ethics becomes a sort of prolonged negotiation between two imperatives. On the one hand, the need to make moral truth intelligible and a belief in morality respectable in what Max Weber called a disenchanted world, and the need to preserve morality and to treat it as something different from and better than mere preference or taste. That brings us to what we might call the analytic tradition in philosophy. This metaphysical unease about what goodness is was something that figures such as Wittgenstein, the logical positivists of Vienna, what they translated into a series of linguistic puzzles. Are moral judgments capable of being true or false? And if they are true, what makes them so? If not, what do those sentences express? Now, you could identify one tradition, the one to which G.E. Moore belonged, as the realist tradition, people who thought that moral truths, moral facts exist independently of us. By contrast, you've got people in the tradition represented by figures such as A.J. Ayer, whom I shall talk about in a moment, who say that moral language is not so much descriptive of something out in the world, but expressive. When I say, for instance, murder is wrong, I'm not stating a fact, but voicing my disapproval. And the resulting dialectic produced a great deal of subtlety, a great many complex and precise distinctions that have ramified over the years, and whole careers have been spent on the grammar of moral discourse. But there was another question that I think lay behind it all, and that rather tended to drift out of sight in the face of all this technical sophistication, and that is, why should morality matter to us at all? Now, A.J. Ayer's 1936 book, Language, Truth and Logic, offered one of the most ruthless versions of the idea I've just mentioned. If meaningful statements must be empirically verifiable and moral statements are not, then, in the strict sense of the word, moral statements are meaningless. Murder is wrong is an unfortunate and syntactically confusing way of saying boo murder. Now, on this picture, the idea of there being such things as non-natural properties vanish, and with it any reason to take morality seriously in the way that one might take science seriously. So on the one hand, we've got the dream of objectivity. On the other hand, the fear that it might turn out to be nothing more than taste, feeling, and preference, none of which has authority. But with that word authority, that brings me to what I think is the real question that lay behind the technical debates. Even if moral claims were true, there is still the question of why they should command us. As the many articulate figures in Plato's dialogues who present this challenge to Socrates repeatedly ask, why be good? It's an excellent question. Why, indeed, ought we, must we be good? And we can call this the question of moral authority. Now, the answer that was given to this question by Plato was metaphysical. To simplify dramatically, the Platonic position, roughly, is that the good simply is reality. To know it is already to love it. But there's another tradition that comes much later in the history of philosophy, and that's the tradition of Immanuel Kant, on which the moral law is not something that's, as it were, out there, part of the nature of things like physical objects, but something that arises from our rational nature. To obey it is simply to be free. And so both of these, the Platonic and the Kantian traditions, offer a sort of vision of moral autonomy. But each of them also produces a kind of alienation or estrangement from the moral. One might think, and people have through history, accused Plato's variety of idealism and morality as something that seemed indifferent to the texture of human life, something that saw the sublunary world, which is to say our world, as something hopelessly second-rate. On the other hand, Kant's, what you might describe as his formalism, seemed relatively indifferent to the sheer variety of human life and human beings. Both of these views, in one way or another, may well be thought to account for the majesty of the moral law, but what they find harder to make sense of is the peculiar mixture of necessity we feel about a moral demand and the perplexity we encounter in relation to it, the sense of being bound by something that is both alien and also most deeply one's own. Now, Plato's story of the ring of Gyges is an early instance of someone dramatizing this question. A man finds a ring that grants invisibility. He kills, steals, and seduces with impunity. The question is put to Socrates, would any of us behave otherwise? Now, Socrates, in response, insists that injustice destroys the soul. The wrongdoer is miserable even when unseen. But that story has endured. It captured our imaginations over the centuries precisely because we can't be entirely sure that Socrates was right. Every age has its own version of the ring of Gyges. Online anonymity, the opacity of powerful institutions, the moral invisibility of distant causes that don't immediately relate to our lives. The question, why be good, persists not because we lack information, but because I think we suspect that the authority of morality rests on something more fragile than something lying out there in the world, a sort of brute necessity. So, if philosophy begins with the question, why be good, you might say that this other thing, this pathology or deformation, moralism, begins with the certainty that other people are not. The figure of the moralizer, the finger-wagging prophet, the self-appointed conscience of the tribe, that figure is as old as ethics itself. Callicles, for instance, mocks Socrates for enslaving the strong to the weak. Nietzsche, more notoriously, diagnosed morality as a form of ressentiment, institutionalized. Our own culture, as anyone with a Netflix subscription knows, offers us endless secular sermons in the form of entertainment. In this sense, you might say that moralism is morality's parody. It borrows the language of virtue while discarding its humility. It's the performance of moral superiority by those who have no real hope of moral understanding. Like all parody, it thrives on repetition. Every generation, including ours, denounces the moralism of its predecessors while cultivating new forms of moralism of their own. So when one is, as it were, moralized at, what one might feel is a sense of alienation, a sense that someone is imposing on me a law to which I have not consented. Now, what is the cure for this feeling of alienation? Well, we've already heard, in a nutshell, what Kant's answer was to it. The moral law is to be found within. The law that binds us is self-imposed, is simply the voice of reason within us. In following the moral law, you're not obeying some source from outside of you, you are simply obeying the voice within, the law that you have given yourself. So there is no more to be said. Why be moral is about as meaningful a question as why keep your New Year's resolution? Well, you made it. So this remains one of philosophy's noblest achievements, I think. But even here, in this attempt to take away the alienation from our experience of morality, the alienation does return to bite. The moral law may be within, but it does often speak in the peremptory tone of command. Kant's moral agent, who is stripped of inclination, those of us who've spent some of our lives reading, studying, and teaching him, he can sometimes seem less like a human being than a sort of bureaucratic disciplinary tribunal in disguise. We can admire the purity of the system, but recoil from its coldness. And so the very theory that identifies morality with freedom can make moral life feel a little bit like subjection to some sort of internal bureaucracy. So we arrive then at the present. Now, no differently from other centuries, moral language still saturates our public life. We moralize about food, the risk that our clothes may be guilty of cultural appropriation, about the ways in which we spend our leisure, about politics, and about what we do with our words. You might think that this produces not a better, clearer sense of morality, but rather a sense of fatigue, a culture somehow both intoxicated and wearied by its own attempts at virtue. Now, in this atmosphere, if the moral voice has lost some of its old authority, you might think that it's because it has lost its capacity for self-awareness. When we speak in tones of outrage rather than those of reflection, in the register of accusation rather than those of acknowledgement, to live in such a climate is to feel both judged and somehow forced to be judgmental, simultaneously ashamed and defiant, to be guilty and somehow also bored. And so the task for philosophy, one task for philosophy as I see it, is not to denounce morality itself, but rather to disentangle it from moralism, to recover a sense of moral thought as a search for truth and understanding rather than a display of purity. And to do that, we need to revisit two contrasting traditions. Now, very crudely, I'm going to call them realism, on the one hand, a tradition which conceives of morality as about discovering some hard order of things that lies outside the human mind, and on the other hand, what I'm going to call romanticism, where that tradition conceives of morality as something more, not like discovery, but more like creation. And so the argument between them, properly understood, I think, is an argument about two ways of conceiving what it is to be morally serious. Now, the history of ethics can be read as a conversation between these traditions, or what I would prefer to call these two temperaments of mind. The realist, as I just put it, believes that moral facts exist independently of us. Our task is to discover them and to bring our thoughts and our lives into correspondence with them. The romantic, by contrast, believes that moral truth is in some sense made, that it arises from the texture of human life, out of some combination of passion, imagination, and self-knowledge. A realism might promise solidity, but at the cost of alienation, by making value something external. Romanticism promises a sort of intimacy, but at the cost of instability. It risks reducing values to matters of taste. Now, each is an attempt to answer the same question. How could moral understanding, how could morality be something both objective and human, binding and yet one's own? And in my view, the most interesting moral philosophers have never belonged entirely to one of these camps, have never had merely one of these temperaments. Every interesting bit of moral philosophy of the last 100 years is an attempt to combine them, often painfully. So the modern genealogy of what I'm calling realism begins with, runs from Moore through Iris Murdoch to, more recently, Derek Parfit. All three, though perhaps what I'm going to say fits Iris Murdoch the best out of these figures, all of these figures conceive of morality as something like vision. The good as something that exists independently of our desires, and our task, the moral task, being to perceive what is out there correctly. Murdoch herself, whom I suppose one might describe as a sort of moral realist, translated this doctrine into psychological language. Moral progress, as she saw it, consisted not in the will, but in attention, the patient, loving attempt to see things and to see people the way they really are. So her realism, you might think, is a realism of vision, a conviction that when seen clearly, the world commands our reverence. And when I say the world, that includes other people. Now, Parfit offered a more austere vision for him. As for the other figures here, moral truths are timeless and impersonal, as objective as the sciences or mathematics. But what they describe is how reasons relate to facts, not, for instance, how our feelings may relate to our lives. In reading someone like Parfit, one senses the grandeur, the beauty of the order he sees, but also, to repeat a word I used in reference to Kant, a sense of chill. If morality is something more like a geometry of value, what becomes of the materials of psychology, of character, of the hesitations and reluctances that constitute moral experience? So, to turn into a sort of of aphorism, one might say the strength of realism lies in its solidity, its weakness, in its distance from the facts of life and of psychology. It offers us a morality that we can admire, but not easily inhabit. Now, the romantic reaction, as one might call it, reverses the direction of gaze. Figures of A.J. Ayer, sorry, slightly odd bedfellows here, but work with me on this, Jean-Paul Sartre, and most recently Bernard Williams. I couldn't find a painting in the same style, I'm afraid, so that's a caricature from the New York Review of Books instead. For these figures, moral life begins with or within the subject. It's not a matter, or not principally a matter of discovering what is already there, but of articulating what one finds oneself caring about. So Ayer's notorious emotivism took this to consist in a view of morality as a sort of expression. Moral language is the verbal equivalent of applauding or hissing. Sartre gave it a sort of existential gravity, a sense of weight, in part because he's probably a better stylist, and a novelist and dramatist who could bring some sense of the texture of life to his philosophy. But for him, nevertheless, value is conferred by some act of the human mind, by an act of choice. And authenticity, the principal value in the existentialist system, consists in acknowledging that freedom and bearing its weight, taking seriously the fact that you bring value into the world by your choices. Now, Williams, who's the figure I'm going to say a lot more about in a moment, I'd say inherited something of that tradition of Sartrean seriousness, but refused some of, again, what I will somewhat rudely call his theatricality. Williams wanted a philosophy that could accommodate, as Sartre's did, the reality of morality and of the world outside the mind, but also acknowledge at the same time the contingency of the self who inhabits that world. Now, all these three figures reject, as a fantasy, the idea of a moral fact or moral knowledge without, as something separate from the facts of psychology. They tell us that the world of value must be a world already interpreted by human beings. To act well on this view is not to conform to an independent order of things, but rather to bring one's actions into an intelligible relation with one's own projects and one's own emotions. Now, Kant, to oversimplify again, had built ethics on that thing that all rational beings share. By contrast, you might say that the Romantics built it on what distinguishes each one of us from all others. They treated individuality, the fact that I am this person and no other, and you are this person and no other. They took those facts not to be a threat to morality, but as its very substance. To be moral, one might say, was simply to live truthfully in one's own skin. So the emphasis lifts from law, something commanded from the outside, to something more like style. Moral life becomes a little bit like artistic life, a work of form, the attempt to give coherence to one's own nature. The good, the right, the just, whatever, these things are no longer the same for everybody, but the achievement of self-consistency within the boundaries of empirical truth. Right, I'm going to expand on that slightly oracular sentence in just a moment, but this is the germ of what Williams would later call moral luck. In one of its senses, this consists in the recognition that we can be answerable for the things that we do, even though we're not entirely responsible for the materials out of which we are made. Now, the figure of Shakespeare's Polonius, generally a comic pedant as presented by Shakespeare in Hamlet, but is worth taking seriously for just a moment for that famous articulation of what would become the Romantic Creed. This above all, to thine own self be true. And that kind of line, it survives because it names a sort of difficulty, not just an ideal. To be true to oneself is not easy. It's not to indulge one's impulses, but to discover through experience which impulses are truly one's own and which are borrowed through convention or fear. So understood this way, the ideal of authenticity is not a license to self-indulgence, but a kind of discipline. It demands that we look steadily at ourselves and the world, resisting both sentimentality on the one hand and cynicism on the other. You might think it's a moral analogue of artistic integrity, a refusal to falsify experience for comfort or consolation. And the risk, of course, is that the pursuit of authenticity collapses into self-absorption, that one mistakes intensity, drama, if you like, for truth. But the cure for that danger, a romantic would say, or should say, is not to suppress the self, is to try to understand it more accurately. That is the point at which I think the romantic imagination could meet what we might call the analytic imagination. Both these traditions, romanticism and analytic philosophy, depend on honesty. Both, in their ways, dislike and distrust pretense. And if we're willing to counter figures such as Descartes as a sort of honorary early member of the analytic tradition for just a moment, you might think something else that connects these traditions is they both begin from the first person and then work outwards to accommodate the world. Now, Bernard Williams, the figure I've alluded to a couple of times already, I think he is the 20th century's most persuasive heir to this tradition. And I say this despite the fact that the word romantic almost never appears in his thought at all. So a lot of this is my attempt to try to conscript him to a tradition that I don't think he ever explicitly attached himself. I'm going to try and make a case that it's an appropriate label nevertheless. To do that, I'm going to have to say a little bit about possibly the most unromantic combination of words that has been said even by an analytic philosopher, the internal reasons thesis. For those who are not already familiar with this notorious claim, very roughly it states that an agent has reason to act, has reason to do something, only if that reason could be reached. A motivation to do that thing could be reached by what he calls a sound deliberative route, from motives that this person already possesses, where those motives could be that agent's desires, his projects, his loyalties, his affections. If it is claimed that someone ought to do something, has reason to do something, even though that thing has no relation with anything that person cares about, Williams claims those sorts of statements are empty, at best an attempt to browbeat someone into acknowledging a reason they don't in fact have, or perhaps an attempt to bring someone into the fold of a reason they didn't have before. But to say that someone has reason to do something, even though that person couldn't even begin to want to do it, that would be to replace the persuasive ambitions of morality with mere coercion. It is then just a form of bullying, to tell someone they have reason to do something they do not and could not care about. One way of describing Williams's larger project here is to think that moral justification has to be continuous with the facts of moral psychology. An ethical reason that could not move anyone to act, could not motivate anyone to act, I think on his view is pretty much a contradiction in terms. And so the effect is to bring some of the more high-minded, ambitious attempts of moral philosophy down to a human scale. Ethics becomes a study of what does or could make sense to us, not in the complacent sense of giving us comfort or consolation, but in the more demanding sense of intelligibility. The moral life then becomes an attempt to render our conduct coherent to ourselves. When we fail, our failure is not simply practical, but also intellectual. We've got it wrong. We have misdescribed our own condition. Now, Williams in the 70s quoted a remark of D.H. Lawrence's, "Find your deepest impulse and follow that." And he quoted it with some approval. And Williams goes on to say, and it's one of his loveliest sentences, there's something about the combination of ideals suggested by that remark, of discovery, trust, and risk, which we also find in another human experience, that of being in love. So it's a line that captures what I'm calling the romantic ambition, but also some of its dangers. Lawrence meant, I suppose, that life, and therefore the moral life, begins in discovery rather than command, but the thing that must be discovered is a fact about the self, and that may not be an easy thing to know. Williams used this phrase to introduce this triad. You might say is a motto of a tradition that I'm going to give a name, a slightly puke-inducing name, but bear with me on this. I'm going to call it analytic romanticism. It's about discovery, trust, and risk. Discovery, because one's identity, one's self, one's motivations, one's desires are not invented themselves, but discovered or uncovered. It's something that's found in the pattern of a life rather than dictated by theory. Trust, because one must act on that discovery without being entirely confident that it will be possible to live a life in line with it. And risk, because of course the discovery may be an illusion. The trust may be misconceived. It may be impossible to live the life that you see as authentic. So those three words define a conception of moral seriousness that is both romantic and analytic. It's romantic because it roots value in the self's attempt to understand its own impulses, but analytic because it subjects that understanding to scrutiny and the demand for truthfulness. So Williams, as I describe him, inherited from the Romantic tradition their conviction that morality must speak as a human to other humans. And from the analysts, that what we say there in that space must withstand rational examination. And out of that tension, he forged a philosophy that sees moral thought as a continuous negotiation between who we take ourselves to be and who we actually are. But that phrase still sounds a little bit like a provocation. The analytic tradition prides itself on sobriety, the romantics on intensity. One values clarity, the other depth. And yet, there's no reason to think one can't have both. What I'm trying to recover tonight, partly out of materials provided by some of Williams's more suggestive remarks, is a style of thought in which precision and passion do not exclude one another. In his work, analysis becomes a form of self-scrutiny, not an escape from feeling. His writing treats moral concepts as instruments of psychological insight. And so if the romantics feared that reason might stifle imagination and the analysts fear that imagination or passion might cloud reason, I think what Williams is attempting to do in his work is to show that both fears mistake what philosophy might do. Not so much drain experience of its colour, but render those colours more truly. So philosophy, as he often said, is about trying to make our best sense of things. The purpose of ethical reflection, not to speak out of nowhere, but to articulate more honestly the view from somewhere, which is the only view that human beings ever do occupy. Now, one of his influential formulations, illustrations of his position, was in reference to the story of Owen Wingrave, which was a story by Henry James, later adapted into an opera by Benjamin Britten. And very roughly, Owen, the main character, is born into a military family that regards the army as a sort of vocation. But Owen doesn't want to be in the army, he wants to be an artist. And so his refusal to enlist is regarded by the family as a betrayal. They're trying to tell him he has a duty to go along with the family tradition and be a soldier. They might equally have said that gives him a reason to be a soldier. Now, Williams's question is simply, what could that claim mean? If Owen has no desires or loyalties that could, through reflection, lead him to the life of a soldier, then the assertion that he has a reason to fight becomes unintelligible. A reason, recall, must be reached by a sound deliberative route from that person's existing motivations. Absent that root, the moral command becomes mere noise or browbeating. The point is that if a reason is going to be a real reason, it had better connect with some fact about us. Now that, in my view, is the heart of analytic romanticism, the conviction that ethics begins in the effort to understand what we truly care about, and that the failure of that effort, our failure of self-knowledge, is itself a kind of moral failure. Now, there are many ways in which the realist position in ethics has been criticized over the years. Some of them have been metaphysical, some of them epistemological, some of them on the basis of appeals to Darwinian evolution. They're all very interesting arguments. A good deal of insight has come out of them, but I think Williams, who addresses them at most in passing, saw them as a sort of distraction. This question of where we fit morality into a world of physical facts, or how we fit it with our claims in metaphysics or epistemology. I think the way he saw it was not so much, the project was not so much about trying to show where morality fits into the physical universe, but rather how we can make sense of certain features of our moral experience without falsifying the self that has that experience. So here I might draw for a moment on a thinker in some ways like Williams, in some ways unlike, and that's Stanley Cavell. Now Cavell has a remark, a somewhat obscure remark, as many of his remarks are, about a position he calls that of the moralizer. What is the moralizer? He says, moralizer is someone speaking in the name of a position one does not occupy, confronting others in positions of which one will not imagine the acknowledgement. I take that to mean something like this. The moralizer is someone who speaks as if from the standpoint of pure reason, but refuses the vulnerability that moral speech entails. He pronounces without entering the conversation to which that pronouncement belongs. And so what I've been calling realism, when pursued as a sort of metaphysics of facts, of moral facts, risks producing just such a voice, authoritative, unanswerable, and somehow inhuman. For both thinkers, Williams and Cavell, moral philosophy is at its best when it restores the element of risk to moral language. The fact that to make a moral claim is, in a manner of speaking, to expose oneself to the risk of error, but more importantly to the risk of embarrassment. Now, if that's the problem, the way in which a certain style of realism might take us to moralism, you might think there are equivalent critiques one might turn in the direction of the Romantic tradition. If morality is based on facts about the self, you might think that simply doesn't give us the kind of necessity we seek. It makes things overly contingent, overly subjective, but just to intensify that critique a little bit, we might say that Romanticism can dissolve into a sort of narcissism. And that probably is true. Romanticism, the kind of pursuit of the self and its ends, if it is untutored by truth, undisciplined by facts outside the self, becomes mere arrant, undisciplined self-expression. But that doesn't take us all the way back to realism, because you may think that what we need here is some attempt not to dispense with the self entirely, not to dispense with the self in our moral thought, but to refine it, to make that self accountable to the resistance or friction provided by reality. And that includes the facts of science, that includes the facts of history, it includes the facts of psychology, and perhaps most importantly of all, the facts of other people's lives. And so in a strange way, this is William sounding a little bit more like Iris Murdoch. It's a matter of seeing other people as something entirely outside of the control of one's will. So could there be such a thing as a truthful romanticism? In the last book that was published in his life, called Truth and Truthfulness, Williams identified two virtues that he thinks underwrite every other. the virtue of sincerity and the virtue of accuracy. Sincerity is about whether our words reflect our thoughts, and accuracy is about whether our thoughts reflect the world outside our minds. A truthful romanticism would be one that unites these virtues. It treats the moral life as the pursuit of self-understanding, but in a way that is disciplined by fact. It's part of a constant effort to align our convictions with a reality outside our minds. And so truthfulness is not just an epistemic virtue, but an ethical one. It's part of an attempt to get us to see our own motives clearly and to acknowledge the world's and other people's capacity to correct them, to chasten them. So the romantic may begin from the self, but the romantic doesn't have to end there. Romantic sincerity is something that has to be answerable to accuracy, self-expression to some feature of reality. So this point can be brought to life by Williams's well-known account of the life of the artist Paul Gauguin. Gauguin, as people now know, notoriously abandoned his family to paint and spread venereal disease in Tahiti. Was he justified? Now that question, I think, is hard to settle by a rule. It requires, among other things, a judgment about truthfulness. What kind of picture we have of Gauguin requires us to ask not just the question, was he doing something wrong, but also the question, might he have been lying to himself? Did he see the reality of those he harmed? Or was it just the slightly deluded romance of his own self-conception? Now for Williams, the moral failure, if failure there was, lies not in disobedience to a law somehow unmoored from the self, but in a kind of self-misrepresentation. And Gauguin's tragedy, you might think, is emblematic of the tragedy of all romantic aspiration, that the stories by which we justify ourselves may be false. So a phrase one might use to refer to this is one that's borrowed from a tradition that I've been echoing here in my phrase analytic romanticism. The phrase analytic Marxism was used by a number of thinkers in the 70s and 80s who wanted to get rid of some of the weirder elements of Hegelian metaphysics and come up with a sort of hard scientific sort of Marxism based on sensible things like rational choice theory. And one of the phrases this school of thought, people like Jon Elster, Jerry Cohen, used for themselves was to call themselves no bullshit Marxists. I don't think this is a phrase Williams ever used of himself, but I invite you to consider it as a way of describing the project. An analytic romanticism is a sort of no bullshit romanticism, and you kind of need that because romanticism contains a good deal of bullshit. The kinds of writers whom William admires and repeatedly draws on in his work are those who combine passion with clarity. Nietzsche, Joseph Conrad, the aforementioned D.H. Lawrence, and I think he mistrusted those who seemed to be guilty of a certain incontinence of style, to be unable to see themselves for the kinds of, and again, I apologize for repeating this word, for the kinds of bullshit as they were. So the attitude, the no bullshit attitude you might think, is the courage to look at experience without self-deception or evasion. And so a no bullshit romanticism would be a kind of ethics of candor. It accepts that the self is, to some degree, opaque. It knows that our motives are mixed. Ideals often conflict. And so what it rejects is a fantasy of total moral clarity, of the kind that analytic philosophy often pursues, not just in moral philosophy. So its measure of seriousness is not certainty, but the capacity to live with uncertainty more truthfully. So what this acknowledges, this project acknowledges, is that the work of getting things right is not a matter of, you check your arguments, check they're all valid and the premises are plausible by checking them against the big book of true premises that tells you whether your arguments are sound, and then the work is done. Got all our moral beliefs sorted out and the rest of life is going to be easy, like an algorithm that just runs itself. Well, it's not going to be like that. The work of getting things right, getting ourselves right, getting the world right, because we are so prone to self-deception, is a task that is endless. So we can now return to the title of this talk. I called it The Problematic and the Unproblematic. Now, our age, the last 20 or so years, the years of my adulthood, have been years of problematizing. It is our go-to word, the word of, as it were, my generation and the ones after. To call something problematic has some of the same force as people in past centuries might have achieved in calling something wicked or sinful. It signals a kind of moral sensitivity, and it can be a powerful gesture, right? Something we can apply to foodstuffs, to people's dressing choices, to any element of popular culture. Now, a truthful romanticism, as I'm conceiving of it, is something that resists these reflexes. It invites us to acknowledge rather than to denounce, and to see morality as part of an ongoing conversation, not simply an attempt at denunciation. Cavell, whom I'd quoted earlier, he wrote that moral understanding is something that's going to require both imagination and humility, the sort of imagination that enables us to enter into the lives of others, and the humility to recognize one's own partiality, the incompleteness of one's understanding, and one's own tendency to deceive oneself. So on this view, on this project, it's not that words such as wrong or indeed problematic are ruled out, it's just we've got to see them as the beginning of a conversation, as part of an exchange of reasons. Moral language recovers its dignity when it becomes dialogical again. But however chastened, I don't think we can mistake Romanticism for a complete moral philosophy. There are experiences, those of cruelty, of humiliation, that demand the language of law and right, perhaps not of style and self-understanding. Williams knew that, and I think this is very clear in his more explicitly political writings. But I think his quarrel with realism is not that it makes a claim to truth, but I think that it forgets some of the human cost of claiming it, particularly when it makes that claim outside of the kinds of public political contexts in which that kind of language has the most force, and turns it into something that can be an endless feature of even the private life. Every personal decision turned into an occasion for these sorts of self-recrimination. So even when morality comes to us as it comes in our talk of injustice or cruelty, even when it comes to us as a command from the outside, our task remains one of interpretation. We still have to make sense of those concepts, of humiliation, of cruelty, of injustice, in light of what we know about what it is to be human. So to acknowledge the objectivity of some demands is not to abdicate understanding, but to deepen it, to try and place those values, those concepts, those virtues in the context of human life itself. It's to say that politics has its place, bureaucracy has its place, but that place doesn't have to be in the private life. So getting it right in this register means bringing thought, feeling, and action into harmony, both with each other, but also with the resistance or friction provided by the world. So that, I think, helps us to see a little bit about what kind of remedy Romanticism, the tradition of the sort of Romanticism that I'm trying to defend here, offers to moralism. Moralism speaks in the voice of certainty. What Romanticism restores is the voice of uncertainty, not least an uncertainty about the self. So a chastened, an analytic, a no bullshit, a truthful Romanticism, something governed by and that holds itself accountable to both sincerity and accuracy, will be something that insists that moral life, like human beings, is plural. There are many ways of being decent, many languages of the good. And disagreement is just part of the normal condition of ethics, not a scandal. So in that spirit, philosophy ceases to wag its finger and learns again to extend a hand. It calls us back from the theatrics of blame and condemnation to the harder, quieter work of self-knowledge and the understanding of one another. I suppose in doing so, it reawakens something of this old romantic confidence that a life honestly examined can justify itself. Now suppose we could bring back some of that spirit of the romantic project of philosophy. Well, you might think philosophy will then have earned its place once more in the conversation of human beings. Thank you very much.
Well, Nikhil, thank you so much for that extremely thought-provoking talk. I've said I wouldn't ask you more than 3 questions. I've got about 24 I could ask you. Let me cycle back to the beginning of your talk when you were talking about realism and metaphysical questions about morality. Somebody might say, well, look, you can establish as firmly as could be that there are some moral truths, that moral thought is a matter of discovery. But establishing that gets you no closer to knowing which those truths are. What's the link, therefore, between the kind of first-order moral questions that you're addressing here, where morality should interfere and where it shouldn't, and the metaphysical stuff you were talking about in the beginning of the lecture?
Well, I suppose the way I was conceiving of the problem is that the way in which one thinks about the status of one's claims in morality makes a difference to the spirit in which one actually expresses them, makes them, engages in a moral conversation. If one thinks one is speaking simply for reality itself, on behalf of reality, having discovered the moral truths, whatever they are, there's a certain voice in which that's going to be conveyed to someone else. Someone who disagrees is simply someone in error. But if all we're all trying to do is understand ourselves, understand the world, try and bring ourselves into consistency and to alignment with the features of the world we can see, then it's going to be a very different sort of conversation as a result. I cannot speak from on high because there is no on high position to speak from. There's me, here's one human being, here's another human being, all flawed. We're all trying to engage in this project of trying to make sense of ourselves and get it to align with the world. So there is no special position of authority from which a moral claim may simply be pronounced at someone else. And that does seem to produce a different sort of first-order conversation than the one where some of us just have the truth already.
Good. And that leads me neatly to my second question, I think. So you were invoking this kind of metaphysical certainty as something the moralist needs and trying to undermine that. Couldn't moralism claim that it is moral criticism in the name not of some metaphysical certainty, but in the name of impartiality, which is itself a first-order commitment? I think that's the kind of thing that Parfit might say, for example.
I mean, that's an interesting question, isn't it? Is impartiality a first-order commitment, in the sense that in saying that what one should do is to regard matters impartially, one is already engaging in morality, rather than saying something about the nature of moral thought? Well, I suppose I'm simply not sure whether that is true. I mean, is it true that impartiality in this sense is a first-order claim? When you make any moral claim at all, on the understanding that I've got this right, and if you're not acting in light with it, you're making a mistake of some sort. The thought, as I understand it, is that there is a perspective on the situation that's not simply my perspective, your perspective, but, to use that notorious 19th century phrase, the point of view of the universe. And that does seem to be something that stands at one remove from the things one is saying. Right? One doesn't say murder is wrong, from the point of view of the universe. One simply says murder is wrong, and one then invokes the point of view of the universe or the view from nowhere or whatever. One is then saying something about why the claims we're making have some special authority, why they're worth taking seriously. And there the analogy, I suppose, with something like science or mathematics, perhaps science more obviously. If we think some people simply have expertise on matters of the sciences, they know things that we don't, they understand things that we don't understand because we've just not done the work, we haven't done the research, we haven't conducted the experiment, we haven't put in the hours in the lab. So I'm forced then to defer to the authority of someone who has done that work and is therefore in a position to pronounce about it. Now, we can take that sort of idea seriously, in part because we know that there is a thing that science studies that has nothing to do with the human will. It's not simply a matter of if I just spend long enough on self-examination, I'm going to discover the laws of mechanics. I can't. It seems there is no other way there. But just nothing seems equivalent to that in the moral realm, nothing that consists in that work of laboratory experiment or field work, the observation of how zebras behave in the wild. All there is the observation of us with each other. And it looks like the very ideal of impartiality then becomes a much more puzzling thing.
Good. Last question. I think when you're talking about Kant, you said that Kantian ethics can sometimes feel like bureaucracy intruding upon your inner world and trying to run your life for you. And you came back to the topic of bureaucracy at the end of the talk when you said that although there were certain sorts of issues, such as issues about cruelty and injustice, which were perhaps needed to be thought of in the moralist's way, you wanted to draw this distinction between private life, into which the administration of the moral cannot enter, and those domains where it's appropriate. But recently we've seen some legislation in this country about domestic abuse, for example, broadening of the legislative definition of domestic abuse, which seems to be precisely an intrusion of the public and the bureaucratic into the private sphere, but which proponents of those laws would claim needed to happen in order for the interests of justice to be served. What's your comment on that?
Yes, I think that's a very helpful way of bringing out, just making it necessary to make an important clarification of exactly what this distinction between the public and the private consists in. I think whatever that distinction consists in, it can't simply be what happens inside the house and what happens outside the house, though that could often make for a good proxy for the kinds of things we have in mind with that distinction. Really, I mean, at the risk of circularity, the distinction we're trying to draw is simply those aspects of life where bureaucratic modes of thought are right, proper, and appropriate, and the ones which they're not. And very loosely or roughly, you might think the private just refers to that area of life where bureaucratic modes of thought are not appropriate. But of course, the example you bring out says, well, that probably is a place where the law, justice, punishment, these are matters that seem eminently reasonable to apply there. So that proxy, that initial promising proxy can't be right anymore, right? I mean, I have a great deal more to say about it, but I think for now, I'll say something a bit vaguer or more promissory, which is what that example does is to tell us what the project is. It's to say, what is it that we should conceive of as private? There was a time in the 19th century when just marriage to core is regarded as a private thing. No action, however abusive, could possibly be brought under the ambit of moral judgment. I don't think we think that anymore. We shouldn't think that anymore. But it doesn't follow then that every feature of the private life thereby becomes a suitable matter for moral judgment in this sort of bureaucratic style. So something like, so because domestic abuse is a horrible thing and the law has a proper place there, doesn't mean, for instance, that norms about equal distribution of labour straight away applies to the division of household chores. It might do, but that's not something we should take for granted as the right way of thinking about it. Right? This is a human negotiation between two people, and you're going to have to find a way of living with each other. And sure, drawing up a spreadsheet is one way in which some people do that, but the idea that somehow a priori we decide the proper mode in which to decide on a question like that, who does the washing up, is to be done on the model of a spreadsheet, in the style of some sort of large bureaucracy. That seems like a distortion of the moral life. So because it made sense for one thing in the private sphere, we're at risk of sort of giving up the rest of it. Whereas the rest of it is still up for grabs. We still need to ask ourselves how much, what sort of bureaucracy, language, thought, discourse is the right one. And that's a human decision you have to make.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, you said you could say more. Perhaps you'll get the opportunity to say more in answer to your questions. So over to you, please.
Hi, Nikhil. You set out a sort of a hybrid, I suppose, with Bernard Williams's idea, drawing on something of each. But I wonder to what extent we might be able to have aspects of both in a slightly different, more full-blooded way, by which I mean...
Sorry, both realism and romanticism, is that what you mean?
And that they just both be different things, that we're just talking about slightly different things here when it comes to morality, that sometimes we act in line with the romantic ideal and sometimes with the realist ideal, and therefore that moral analysis isn't deciding which one's right so much as deciding which one we're talking about in each case.
Yes, I mean there is a little red paper by Peter Strawson from the late 40s called something like Social Morality and Individual Ideal, I think, which makes a case for something along the lines of what you just sketched. I don't think anything you said made me want to disagree straight away. What I was drawing there, I suppose, wasn't a theoretical contrast in the sense that to be a realist you must reject romanticism, and to be a romantic you must reject realism. I was trying to think of them as more like temperaments, certain styles of thought that some of us are more drawn to than... we find that one of them is something we're more drawn to than the other, and I think that is true of a lot of people, that they find one immediately sympathetic and the other less so. If we were looking for a sort of clear theoretical contrast, we already have some, right? We have realism versus anti-realism, for instance. But the thing is, anti-realism isn't a sensibility. You can't live as an anti-realist. There's nothing an anti-realist life looks like. I mean, all anti-realism is to believe in a certain metaphysical position. And there are all sorts of ways in which you could live a life based on that. So what I was trying to do was to come up with a description of the alternative to realism which has a bit more, to use your word in a slightly different sense, a bit more full-bloodedness about it, that there is a sort of romantic outlook. What would it be to have a romantic outlook? Well, I've considered some of the more embarrassing, sort of parodic cases of that. The 18th century painter, the person who sort of is all about their own sensitivity and fine cultivation of aesthetic instincts and utter callousness and disregard for other people or for just the facts of the world. And that was the unattractive ideal. And what we're trying to do is to say, well, we might think if that's what it is to be a romantic, well, let's have no more of that. Let's be the most full-blooded kind of realist instead. And what I'm suggesting is that we can have something of what we find attractive in realism, but that still has a sort of romantic foundation, right? So in the end, all there is, what brings value into the world, what brings, to use a technical word, normativity into the world, is some fact about the self and its desires, right? That's what there is. But that doesn't mean there isn't a world outside of it. It doesn't mean there's nothing for that self to be held accountable to. It's just that thing is not this sort of thing called moral fact. It's something else. It's just the world we see. It's the world of material objects, of other people, of society, of history. So that's the spirit of it. It's realistic in the sense that it wants to say we can get things wrong in morality just as in anything else. And it's important to have that ideal of getting things right. The question is simply, what is the thing that we are trying to get right? So that's the sense in which I was trying to use them as contrasts. I freely admit that it's a sort of awkward, what one might call a sort of orthogonal contrast. But that's the reason which I wanted to use that word, romantic, rather than some more precise and theoretical word such as anti-realist.
Thank you. Now, there are lots of questions. Let's work our way forward. Lady, about 5 rows, yes.
I'm thinking about the position of moral philosophy in society. I think in an aside you said, as I would like to see it, playing its role, being taken seriously, having people investigate it. If moral philosophy settles for uncertainty, then doesn't the burden of certainty, which I think we all need, I think people do need certainty, and doesn't that burden get then transferred to politics, and law? I mean, that was the question about law on domestic abuse. And I think historians have noted, actually, in the last 50, 60 years that many, many questions which once were moral have now become legal. It seems to me that that moral philosophy is kind of undermining itself as that enterprise that we would like it to be by settling for uncertainty.
I think I'd resist slightly the thought that what we need is certainty. To draw on another phrase of Williams's, I think what it needs is confidence. It does need confidence. It can't come in there with all those jokes with Mark Twain and one of those 19th century aphorisms about, was it about the liberal? I suppose you could say it about a certain style of moral thought. You can't even take your own side in an argument. That can't be the ideal, I think. That's not an attractive ideal. So it's not a sort of, ooh, who knows? It's all so wonderfully complicated and life is so messy. I think I'm not proposing anything of that sort. So the question, I think, is simply going to be, well, if we are confident in our convictions, what grounds that confidence? And the picture I've been trying to paint here is one of, well, the reason we are entitled to be confident about our moral positions, if we are confident about them, is that we think we have applied the virtues that are relevant to moral thought, and that is sincerity. You say what you actually think. Accuracy, you try to get the world right. You try to get your science right. You try to get your psychology right. You try to get your accounts of other people and society right. You're trying to get everything that can be got right. And when you have, then you have as much confidence as you ever will have. But that brings us to the other side of the contrast you drew. Is it true that politics and law are spaces of certainty? Well, in a sense that's true, in that some lawyers and some judges and some politicians sound very certain. But in another sense, that isn't true. It's not true in the sense that the law changes. It has mechanisms for changing itself. Politics changes. People lose elections, new people come into power, and suddenly we have a new set of institutions, new sets of styles. That's happening, and that's happening all the time. So one set of certainties gets replaced, as it were, with a different set of certainties. But in a sense, you look at it from on high, one removed from what it looks like inside the process, you realize that it isn't a space of certainty in the sense that I'm understanding it, but a space of change. So really, one thing we know about politics is precisely the reason we can afford to be certain in some of our political, in the way in which we present our politics. The reason why judges can say, well, this is the law and I pronounce so, is that they're aware that there's a deeper level at which it's not fixed at all and there is no certainty. Parliament will change the law tomorrow and a judge will say, well, now this is the law. The trouble with morality is that it's claiming a kind of certainty that goes one step beyond that. It's not just the certainty of this is the law that Parliament passed, but this is the law of the universe itself. And it doesn't leave itself open to change. And that's why it seems to me that the risks of certainty there are greater, and which is why I'm proposing instead something like confidence grounded in the virtues of truthfulness as a better and more realistic ideal.
Okay, let's keep moving forward. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. Really fascinating talk. I think one of my concerns is that your account makes morality very individualistic, and I think there's quite a compelling view of morality, and you mentioned it in passing that it's an evolved set of norms or rules that enables humans to thrive, and maybe there's like mimetic evolution, and it's a collaborative enterprise, something we're continuously kind of co-creating together, and I think continuously refining and hopefully facilitating the best possible set of rules that we can have, which kind of constrain behavior in the most optimal way, hopefully to achieve flourishing. And I just feel that kind of view that it's very individualistic and it's kind of romanticized prohibits that kind of scientific-based account of morality and the progress. And I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much. I'll say a few things that are consensus and agree with the kind of project that you're setting out, and I'll say a couple of things where I have reservations. Some views on the kind of project, particularly the scientific project of trying to understand the evolutionary origins of cooperation, cooperative dispositions. I think about the last year, I reviewed a quite interesting book by a German philosopher called Hanno Sauer, called something like Morality, the First 50,000 Years, something like that. It's sort of evolution of morality all the way from the beginning of the universe to about 2019. And it's an interesting book because of the scale of that ambition, to try to see it emerging out of conditions of human beings in the savannah, certain kind of ape who have great success, reproductive success, because of their capacity for certain very complex varieties of cooperation, even with complete strangers. But as with many of these projects, there's a limit to how much they're going to tell us about moral disagreements today. The trouble is, all of us here, every human being, whatever our particular moral views, is descended from those same apes and does possess those same cooperative dispositions. That's why we're here at all. So if we have disagreements now, appeal to those very same dispositions isn't going to help us to resolve them, right? Because if they were going to be resolved already, they would be resolved, right? We wouldn't have the kinds of conflict that we do. So the reason I think for a more individualistic focus is this. Well, there's a couple of reasons. One of them, and this is the more controversial thing I'll say first, I think we are individuals, basically. It's a really important fact about human beings that we're not like schools of phytoplankton who seem more like a kind of unit with just many separate bodies. That's not how we are. It's a really important fact about us, perhaps a basic fact about us, this: I have this body, and it's very clear where my body stops and the rest of the world and other people begin. It's an important fact about me that there are certain kinds of thoughts that are my thoughts and not anyone else's thoughts. Now, it's entirely consistent with all of that, of course, that my thoughts, my beliefs, my personality is something that I didn't create all by myself. It's something that happened as a result of being in a world with other people and knowing that I have to live in a world with other people. Indeed, you might think that is an essential biological fact about human beings. We're not like wolves or jackals or whatever, these animals that can live by themselves. There are no lone wolf humans, really. Human life and human flourishing is only possible when we live in communities of people, and that already means that even the most romantic kind of figure, even Gauguin is going to have someone doing the cleaning, right? Someone else is going to have to grow the crops that he harvests. It's very hard to imagine a completely self-sufficient, off-the-grid human life, and if you were able to pull it off like one of those sorts of, what they call preppers, it's not a particularly attractive vision of human life. It's a sort of paranoid vision of human life. So I'm not going for that, right? So we want some vision of that combines the following two things. I'm an individual, I've got my own thoughts, which I share to a high degree with every other human being, because that's just what we would expect, but I'm also different enough that sometimes I will disagree. And there'll be things I want that other people don't want, and that's fine. We can deal with that. We can deal with these human differences. That's what we have politics, that's what we have law for. But the thing that I'm trying to avoid is the idea that there's something beyond these attempts to get together, cooperate, set up institutions of cooperation that tells us that there is some correct way in which we are required to cooperate. Rather than this sort of mishmash of attempts at compromise to make something work for ourselves, that's what we actually have. What I've been calling realism is an attempt to say, no, it's not just something we create together, it's a thing that just exists as part of the universe. And perhaps there you agree with me, that that's not the right way of thinking about it. The universe isn't telling us how we should live together. We are working out how to live together.
Great.
Thank you.
Now, where have we got to? Okay, 1 and then 2 and then 3, 4, and I think that'll be it.
Hi, Nikhil. So sort of bridging from the last question of the idea of sort of shared norms across society that sort of come from linguistics, sort of your own perception, etc., and they're kind of formed dialogically, sort of idea of dialogical identity whatsoever. And my question is, with your idea of a sort of truthful romanticism, obviously you've got aspects such as moral humility, which will mean you may never be able to be truly truthful. But in a society where, you know, things such as instrumental reason are often prioritized in order to achieve a more efficient, you know, perceived as better society, to what extent can these sort of linguistic norms be, you know, subconsciously manipulated to the extent where you can't have a sort of truthful romanticism in the way you'd hope to?
Yeah, it's quite a rich question. Can I just focus on the very last thing about the manipulation of linguistic norms? The challenge to being a truthful romantic is that we're very bad at knowing ourselves. There are a number of reasons why that we should expect that to be the case. One of them is these are facts about psychology that are not readily available to the consciousness. Some of them have to do with, anyone with Freudian sympathies, the fact that many facts about our psychologies are unconscious. But there are other reasons to do with the world we live in, where there are demands that we understand ourselves in ways that make it easier for us to live with other people. But that way, that sounds all right. But of course, that's equally a device of manipulation. The language of politics or of advertising, these are things which invite us to see ourselves, for instance, as consumers. And so when I think to myself, I really need that, and this is sort of autobiography really, I have an absurd number of shirts. I own so many that I have, since September, I've not worn the same one twice. That's how many I have. So I have a lot of them. And how did that come to be? Is this some essential part of my character that if I were to lose my slightly compulsive desire every time I'm walking past Jermyn Street to buy another fancy shirt, is that really some kind of ineliminable part of my personality? Probably not. It's probably got something to do with some combination of unconscious instincts, vanity, insecurity, and the power of advertising and the kind of language that presents itself, that presents things to me as more attractive than they in fact are. So I suppose language then becomes just one more way in which we can mistake ourselves. And I don't want to see it as some distinct or unique thing, but rather just as part of a project that I've identified in sort of wider terms. What are the many ways in which we can mistake ourselves and our desires? Well, one such way is we start to see ourselves as the creature of what the algorithm of Facebook or the Jermyn Street advertisers want us to be. And that's just one of the many risks that truthfulness is meant to fight. And if it's hard, well, it's because truthfulness is always hard. We're always at risk of getting ourselves wrong.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not a philosopher, I'm a literary scholar, so I was very struck by your inclusion of Polonius and To Thine Own Self Be True, which I would see as a bit of a foil to the instability of Hamlet's self and that as a form of his true self. So I suppose my question for you is, do you see this as that if you see moralism as a form of self-discovery, is there then beneath the surface of deception some true, stable self that you see as something that is uncoverable? And if that's how you see it, I'd just be interested to hear where you see that as coming from, if it's not something that's, say, socially constructed.
Yes, this is a very large question that is quite difficult to answer. I suppose I'll just say a couple of naive things there, because that's the sort of thing one can say under the constraints of this kind of Q&A. I do think there is such a thing as a true self, actually, that is distinct from society. I'll just announce that as a view I have. A view I have despite not having up my sleeve all the arguments one would need to defend it. But I'll say something more modest now. Why is it that we need something like that idea? Right? If we say there is nothing but a self that is socially constructed, it becomes very hard to make sense of why there might be anything at all wrong with certain forms of manipulation, what in its most extreme form you might call brainwashing. If you think there's something uniquely wrong with that project when someone can pull it off, then it must be because there is something that is being washed, some brain, some self, if you like, that is being washed. And if we think, well, it's all socially constructed anyway, it becomes hard to say why manipulation of it would be in any way problematic. If it's just everything is manipulation to start with, then why should some forms of manipulation be particularly problematic? So that's my reason for thinking we need some sort of vision of a true self. Now, is it easy to say exactly what that truth consists in? Of course not, which is why the project of truthfulness is one that's going to be capacious. It's going to say, like, everything that could possibly be irrelevant to trying to understand the nature of that self is on the table. That could include the more problematizing kinds of social theory, would say, oh, isn't it all social construction? But it could equally be more credulous kinds of psychology, would say, look, let's do some MRI scans and see what's actually there in the brain. It could just be the kind of work that social anthropology or the social sciences generally do. Let's observe behavior, use quantitative methods, use whatever methods work in other sciences, and use that to make self a sense of what the human self might be. Now, I'm not a priori a skeptic about these attempts. Some of them will work, some of them won't, just like any projects in science, just like any projects in the humanities. But the point is, none of those things would be worth doing if we didn't think there was some truth about the self to be discovered. So I want to start with that as our starting assumption. But along the way, we may discover that some of the things we want to say about that self are, in fact, naive, were, in fact, excessively credulous. But that's quite different from saying that a priori, some literary scholar has already shown us that the self doesn't exist. That sounds to me far too ambitious a thing to assume.
Thank you. Now we've got, I said, 2 more questions. We've got about 6 minutes, I think. So if you could keep both the question and the answer quite brief, we'll go here and here. Yeah.
Very quick I don't know if that's working, but yeah. Very quick question. Would you say that the opposite of moralism will be compassion when one is judging and the one is accepting?
To some degree, yes. But I would just qualify that in one way. The demand to be compassionate can itself be a form of moralism. When, for instance, one is asked to forgive someone who has wronged one, and that is presented as itself a kind of moral demand. Say, have compassion for this person who wronged you. I have more sympathy for the one who says, well, I might, and it would be a great human achievement if one managed to forgive, I don't know, someone who had tried to kill one. But it seems to me that a non-moralistic view would have to be open to the other possibility, which is that you refuse your compassion, refuse your forgiveness. So it would be an achievement for those who manage to do it, but if someone doesn't, that seems to me equally an authentic expression of self. And I wouldn't want to make compassion itself a kind of requirement, because that itself would become yet another form of coerced, compelled moralism.
And now over here, finally.
Thank you. I'd like to ask about the game theoretic aspect of morality, like coordination problems, right? Like do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If they do unto you that thing, though, right? That otherwise you just be a putz and a mark and such. And historically, like how do these emerge? That kind of compact, that consensus, is it always like imposed? Is something that just evolves? Are there like paradigm shifts that somehow come about? And also how this applies to like the way we view the past. Back then, people, problematizing people back then when they may not have been able to break the compact on their own.
Yeah, if we can just address the game theoretic question here, I suppose it's a similar answer to the one that I had given to the question about evolution, right? So there is an extremely interesting project of trying to make sense of the quite impressive human capacity for cooperation, the kinds of evolved dispositions that enable us to do that. There's an example from this American anthropologist, Sarah Hrdy, I think, who talks about just how people behave on flights as compared to how a chimpanzee might behave on a flight. And she has this quite vivid description of what happens when you actually try to strap a bunch of chimpanzees and expect them to just deal with chimpanzees from a completely different tribe, and compare that to the kind of pliant, cooperative way in which human beings, however frustrated and angry, manage to get through 9 hours red eye. And that does tell us something important and true and deep about human beings. We have these capacities. Now, trying to understand them, evolutionary theory is one source of insight on that. Game theory is yet another. But the phenomena that I'm interested in really are kind of, despite all that, despite all of the fact that we have these coordination dilemmas, we still have disagreement, right? So whatever that disagreement is, it seems to me that game theory and evolution can't be the solution. They can't be the answer to it, because all they do is to explain how it is that we have the attributes that enable us to cooperate. But if we then fail, then those theories aren't then going to solve the problem for us. What they're going to do is to sort of set out the conditions under which they now need to be solved. We're aware that we sometimes make the wrong choice in prisoner dilemma type situations. We're aware that these people with instincts for cooperation nevertheless sometimes fight. So what do we do next? And there it seems to me a different kind of philosophy, a different kind of thought would be needed.
Very good point at which to draw things to a close. Apologies to those of you who had questions and didn't have time to ask them. We are here again next week with Gina Rini, who'll be talking about the nature of public philosophy. I believe that there are drinks where, Anissa? In this little... Oh, you need to exit and then go back in through another door for those of you who've signed up for them. But let us not draw things to a close without thanking Nikhil for a really fascinating evening.